Alright, boys and girls, up to now, we have been talking primarily about parts of speech, but it is time to graduate from grammar school and go into more grammar school, talking about sentence structure. The thing we're going to do in today's video is just talk about some sentence structure definitions so that we know what we're dealing with here. So, we're talking about clauses. What is a clause? Up until now, we've been talking about clauses and phrases as being fairly interchangeable, and to a lot of people they are interchangeable. Many people use both of those words to describe any phrase, any group of words with a connected idea. But for the purposes of this test, we want to use a very specific definition for clauses. A clause is a phrase that contains a subject and a verb. It has someone doing something. So, for example, the man in the car. That is not a clause, because you don't have a verb. You don't have that man doing anything. You only have a subject. Running across the street. That is also not a clause. It is a phrase, but it is not a clause, because you don't have a person running across the street. Even something like Andrew running across the street. Not a clause, because we don't actually have a verb there. We would need to say Andrew ran across the street, or Andrew is running across the street. So, any clause requires a subject and a verb, and the subject must be doing that action. We have to have a subject-verb pair. The first type of clause we're going to define today, and arguably the most important clause for you to be able to recognize, is the independent clause. This is a clause that can stand alone as a complete sentence. It's independent. It could be a sentence. So, a sentence like, Chapman is a doctor. That's a great independent clause, right? Chapman is a doctor. That could be a sentence. Or it could be part of a larger sentence. Chapman is a doctor and he cured my acne. In this sentence, we actually have two independent clauses, right? Chapman is a doctor. That could stand alone as a sentence. He cured my acne. That also could stand alone as a sentence if I just had, he cured my acne. Yeah, that's a perfectly fine sentence. So these are two independent clauses connected with the word and. Some might even say they were conjoined together with a conjunction. That is the part of speech that and is. Our next type of clause is a dependent clause. This is a clause, it does have a subject and a verb, but for some reason it cannot stand alone as a sentence. How about, after he cured my acne? We've got the word after. That means it's not a sentence. You could say he cured my acne, that's a sentence. But when I add the word after, that makes it not a sentence. After he cured my acne. You have to have something else, right? I felt much better. This sentence has our dependent clause, after he cured my acne, and an independent clause, I felt much better. I felt much better. When I go out, I'm no longer embarrassed by my skin. When I go out, could that be a sentence on its own? Definitely not. I am no longer embarrassed by my skin. Could that be a sentence on its own? Absolutely yes. So we have a dependent clause and an independent clause, and those two make up a sentence. I am no longer embarrassed by my skin could be its own sentence, but since when I go out couldn't stand on its own, you must attach it to a big boy independent clause in order to make that sentence grammatically correct. The next type of clause that we want to be able to identify is the relative clause. This is a specific subset of dependent clauses that use relative pronouns. If we were going to make a Venn diagram of dependent clauses and relative clauses, the relative clauses circle would be entirely inside the dependent clauses circle. So, these require relative pronouns. Words like who, which, where, and that. Chapman is the doctor who cured my acne. This sentence has two clauses, right? Chapman is the doctor, that's an independent clause, and who cured my acne? That is a relative clause. It could be a question, because we don't know who cured my acne if it's standing on its own. It couldn't be its own sentence. Who cured my acne? I don't know. You need to connect it to something else so we know. The last big structure that we need to be able to identify is modifiers. So a modifier is any phrase that is not a clause. That is, it does not have a subject and a verb. Hoping to cure my acne, Chapman gave me a special herb. Or if you're British, herb. So, in this sentence, Chapman gave me a special herb is my independent clause. But what about hoping to cure my acne? Is that a clause? What's the subject? Who's hoping to cure my acne? Well, Chapman is, but he is appearing in a different part of the sentence. He's not in the same phrase as hoping to cure my acne. That's a whole different phrase. So what this means is that there's no subject in this sentence. What about verbs? Are there any verbs in this phrase? Hoping to cure my acne. I mean, cure is technically a verb, but it's actually part of a prepositional phrase. Hoping to cure my acne. There really isn't a verb there. Hoping is technically a gerund. It's a word that is closely related to a verb, it comes from a verb, but it itself could not be the main verb of a sentence. A brilliant doctor. Chapman gave me a special herb. This is another example of a sentence that contains an independent clause, Chapman gave me a special herb, and a modifier, a brilliant doctor. Who is the brilliant doctor? It's not part of that phrase, so that is not a clause. There's no verb there either. Definitely not a clause. Notice something interesting about modifiers. They can go anywhere in the sentence. Chapman gave me a special herb, hoping to cure my acne. Here, I've just bumped this modifier to the end of the sentence, but the sentence still makes sense. It's still that Chapman was hoping to cure my acne and that Chapman gave me a special herb.